If you watch my previous videos on Iran, you'll know we've been building towards this possibility for a few weeks now. I talked about the carrier strike group deployments, the strategic signaling between the US, Israel, and Iran, and then also what day one might look like. And well, day one is here. So we saw earlier today, we saw strikes on Iran by Israel and the US, and then retaliatory strikes with Iran launching ballistic missiles towards Israel and to also target other targets in the region. So the question is no longer whether escalation would happen. The question is now, what's the objective? Because when you strip away the headlines, the rhetoric, the political noise, wars are ultimately about objectives, and right now the objectives matter far more than the explosions. So let's first look at what Israel wants out of this. And Israel's objective is, I think, fairly straightforward. So this isn't, for Israel's case, this isn't primarily about regime change in Tehran. Israel's focus is going to be on capability degradation. So they want to see Iran's nuclear infrastructure, missile capability, launch capability degraded significantly, that it poses far less of a risk than it does. So that means striking IRGC command nodes, reducing Iran's ability to coordinate proxy forces across the region. So we're talking Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. So, and from Israel's perspective, Iran is not just a hostile state, it is the central node of a regional encirclement strategy. So you've got Hezbollah in Lebanon, you've got Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, IRGC presence in Syria, and all roads lead back to Tehran. So if Israel can meaningfully damage Iran's ability to project power outwards, it buys strategic breathing space. And this obviously isn't about occupying Tehran, it's about pushing the Iranian threat envelope further away from Israeli borders. And now let's look at what the US wants out of this. And this is where things become a little bit more complex. Now, before we go into this, it's important to remember that there was an agreement in place that was designed to limit Iran's nuclear capability, and this was the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was between Iran, US, the UK, a number of EU nations, I think China as well. And under this agreement, Iran accepted restrictions and intrusive inspections in exchange for sanctions relief. In 2018, the US did withdraw from this deal and reimpose sanctions on Iran, arguing that this deal didn't significantly constrain Iran's long-term nuclear ambitions or its regional behavior. And that withdrawal fundamentally changed the strategic landscape with regards to Iran and its nuclear deal. So, and since then, Iran has gradually reduced its compliance and expanded its uranium enrichment, and obviously increased its leverage through both its nuclear program and its regional proxy network. So whether you view the 2018 withdrawal as a strategic correction or a mistake, it undeniably removed the diplomatic buffer that once helped to contain this sort of confrontation. And now fast forward to today, and the US is obviously striking Iran, but has not mobilized a ground invasion force. So it's important to look at the assets that the US has deployed to the region. There's no 2003 style buildup, there's no mass troop assembly in Kuwait, no heavy armored brigades stationed for entry, and no visible logistical footprint for a occupation force. And this obviously matters significantly, because regime change alone by air power, or rather, by air power alone, is extraordinarily difficult and almost impossible. So you can obviously destroy facilities, you can kill commanders, you can target key infrastructure, you can create an infrastructure, but collapsing a regime requires something a lot more fundamental. So either an internal uprising, military fragmentation, or a ground invasion. And none of these really appear to be in motion at any scale. So what does Washington likely want out of this? And I would argue it's more around deterrence restoration. So the US has been under sustained pressure by Iranian proxies in the region. So if you look at shipping disruptions, constant low-level destabilization, at the same time, with the nuclear agreement no longer acting as a constraint framework, escalation dynamics have become a lot more direct and less structured. So from a credibility point of view as well, especially after years of incremental escalation, the US would also probably feel compelled to demonstrate that direct strikes on Iranian soil are once again on the table as an option. And we've seen this kind of building up over the last few weeks. It's become more and more likely that this was going to happen in any case. And obviously, this is very strong coercive signaling. And the message is simple. If you escalate, we can escalate higher. So it's ultimately de-escalation through escalation. And now let's address the one key discussion point, is regime change the ultimate goal? Or is it secretly the objective? It's possible that some factions in Washington or Jerusalem would welcome it, but welcoming it and collapse and actively engineering it are obviously two very different things. Because as I mentioned earlier, actively creating it or bringing it about requires a lot more than what is in the region at the moment. Also consider that regime change requires a plan for the day after. Who governs Iran? What happens to all the nuclear material that's in the country? What happens to the RGC? What happens to the country's ethnic fault lines, the Kurds, the Baluchis, the Azeris? Remember that Iran is not Iraq. It's larger. It's far more cohesive, more nationalistic, and far more capable militarily than Iraq ever was. So an unmanaged collapse could produce a massive civil war, nuclear material instability, refugee flows, regional fragmentation, or a massive power vacuum that gets exploited by extremist groups. So obviously the US and Israel understand this and would want to actively avoid something like this because it creates far more problems than it actually solves. So it's unlikely that this strike campaign is designed to topple the regime outright, at least in the sort of short to medium term. It's far more likely that the US objective aligns broadly with Israel's objective, which is strategic degradation, restored deterrence, and pressure without occupation. And obviously there is a risk with that, is that air campaigns and strike campaigns have a logic of their own, because once missiles start flying, escalation becomes very dynamic rather than deliberate. So Iran obviously cannot afford to be weak domestically. Israel cannot afford to be viewed as vulnerable, and the US cannot afford to appear indecisive. So you've kind of got three pillars here that are all going to flex around, and everybody else has to respond in real time to those movements. It's a triangular pressure which kind of creates momentum. And even if regime change is not the stated objective, sustained strikes on leadership targets, nuclear facilities, RGC infrastructure could weaken internal stability over time. And at that point, events might outrun intentions. And that's kind of the strategic reality of what may come out of this. What we appear to be seeing right now is not a war of conquest, it's a war of punishment and deterrence. Israel wants to neutralize immediate threats, and the US wants to establish or re-establish dominance over this process. Iran obviously wants to demonstrate that it cannot be intimidated. So the next few days really matter enormously because it's going to determine which way this is going. If it remains limited, kind of a tit for tat, missile strike for strike type thing, it may settle into a contained confrontation. But if the proxy forces ignite simultaneously, so we're talking about Hezbollah, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq, this may expand into something a lot bigger and a lot less limited. And this is my final thoughts, is that just because there's no invasion force assembled does not mean that this is a minor consideration. But the absence of a ground component strongly suggests that a full-scale regime change is not the immediate operational objective. So whether this stays this way depends entirely on what happens within the next week.